Scripture this evening is Galatians chapter 4, verses 4 through 5. But when the fullness of the time came, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, so that he might redeem those who were under the law, that we might receive the adoption as sons.
You know, Galatians chapter 4 and verses 4 through 5 that was read just a moment ago, Paul talked about the fullness of time. In the fullness of time, God sent Jesus to this earth. He sent him born of a woman so that he might redeem us. He sent him at that fullness of time when everything was just the way that it should be. A few weeks ago, Peggy mentioned to me, I mentioned something about Pharisees or Sadducees in the intertestamental period, maybe in class, and she said you need to do a sermon on that time period, that time between Malachi and Matthew, and the things that took place there that we see the roots of in the New Testament. And I agreed with her. I thought that was a good thing to do, because we do not spend a lot of time there. We don't talk a lot about that time frame. 400 years in which God was silent, that he didn't speak after. And really Malachi is not the last book. Probably Nehemiah was being written last. But from that point all the way to the time in which Gabriel speaks to Mary, God is not talking through prophets anymore for 400 years. And so we have this 400 years of silence, and I think because of that, maybe we don't spend a lot of time there. But many things that we see in the New Testament have their roots there in what we call that intertestamental period. And understanding this time helps us to understand, I think, better the New Testament. This morning in Acts class, I was actually going to talk about it in my sermon, but then when I saw I was going to be talking about it in class, I took it out. But we looked at the Epicureans, we looked at the Stoics that Paul was debating with there in the city of Athens before he gave that great sermon on the Areopagus. And both of those groups, both of those philosophical groups, have their origins in the middle of this time frame, in the middle of this intertestamental period between Malachi and Matthew. I want us to consider a few things. Number one, think about John chapter 10. John chapter 10 tells us that at that time the feast of the dedication took place in Jerusalem. Now, if you are one of those people that goes, I'd like to find out about that feast, and you flip back to Leviticus or Exodus, where they list some of these feasts that the Jews were to have, you'll never find it. You'll never find the Feast of Dedication there. It's not a feast that's listed in the Old Testament. It's not one that is in the law of Moses. Now today we kind of know it by another name. We're kind of familiar with the modern name of Hanukkah, and most people know what that is. But that is the Feast of Dedication, and it commemorated the cleansing of the temple. The cleansing of the temple after its desecration by Antiochus of Epiphanes. Now Antiochus, he was a Seleucid leader, and between the Seleucids, which would be modern-day Syria to the north of Israel, and the Egyptians, the Ptolemaic Empire, they fought, and Israel was just caught in the middle all through the times that they were fighting during this intertestamental period. Well, Antiochus went down to Egypt, and he was defeated by the Ptolemies, and in a fit of rage, in a fit of anger, he came back and took it out on the city that was between him and home, and that was Jerusalem. And he came into the temple, and he offered a pig on the altar of God. He took everything that the temple had in it and stole it, took it for himself. He then took the ashes of the pig that he offered on the altar of God, and he put it in water. And then he splashed the temple with that water all over to spread the unclean nature of that pig throughout the entirety of the temple. And then if that was not enough, he then built an idol to Zeus on the top of the altar there in the temple. So he thoroughly desecrated the temple in 169 BC. And in chapter 12, verse 11 of the book of Daniel, we see that Daniel refers to this event, what Antiochus Epiphanes did on that particular day. he would call the abomination of desolation. And Jesus would take that and he would quote that same phrase in Matthew chapter 24 and verse 15 when he's talking about the total destruction of the temple in AD 70. He uses the same phrase that Daniel used in regard to what Antiochus did in defiling the temple, and that is that it was the abomination of desolation. Well, sacrifices at the temple at that time ceased. All the activity that was geared toward God ceased in the temple for 3.5 years, until 3 years later when the Maccabee revolt would retake Jerusalem. They cleansed the temple, they rededicated it, and they resumed sacrifices in 165 BC. And that's really what this Feast of Dedication was remembering. It was commemorating this time in which they were able to retake the temple to be able to cleanse it and be able to resume the sacrifices that were going on. Well, all of that happened during this intertestamental period. And I want us to also take note, when we think about holidays, we think about different celebrations that we might have as a culture, such as Christmas and things of that nature, and we say, well, they're not in the Bible. Well, Jesus was observing this one, and it wasn't in his Bible either. And so I think we need to be careful with how we talk about that sometimes, because this was not while it was carried out at the temple, it was not a law of Moses holiday at all, but yet it was something that Jesus participated in, and it was something that we see there in the New Testament. I think there is a lot of similarity between what happened at that particular time and their desire to commemorate that and to remember that, as maybe we've seen in our current lifetimes. When Israel retook the Western Wall. Now, if you talk to a Jewish person today in Israel, they'll tell you it's not the Wailing Wall. It was the Wailing Wall up until 1967, and then they took back Jerusalem and took the Western Wall, and it stopped being the Wailing Wall because they no longer had to stand at a distance and weep because they couldn't get to that wall that was really the wall that was the retaining wall that the temple was built on top of. And so now it's just called the Western Wall, and that's the wall you see over there still today. When Jonah and I were in Israel, it was the 50-year anniversary, and you cannot believe the celebration in the streets. We were trying to get back to the hotel, and there were literally tens of thousands of people packed in the streets from building to building in the streets with Israeli flags and stuff, and they were all going to the temple for this huge to the Western Wall for this huge celebration, remembering the time in which they were able to, as they saw it, once again get close to where the temple had once been. Throughout the New Testament, we also read about Jews and their synagogues. Once again, if you go flipping back through the pages of your Old Testament looking for that word synagogue, again, you're not going to find it. There are no synagogues in the Old Testament. It's not a part of the Old Law. It's never mentioned there. Synagogue, that word is used very similarly as our word church. How many of you have gone by and say, go by this building during the week and go, there's the church? Well, some people kind of get riled up about that. Well, that's not the church, that's the building. Well, okay, that's true. We understand that. But I want you to understand that synagogue is a word that was very similar. And it was used in both ways, just like we use church in both ways to refer to us as a people, but also we refer to this building as a church building or a church. And they used synagogue the same way. Synagogue was a group of people. In John chapter 9 and verse 22, when the blind man was being interrogated by the Pharisees about Jesus healing his blindness, it said that they were going to put him out of the synagogue. Now, what it's talking about there when it says that is he was going to be ostracized or removed from the group of people that were the synagogue. And so he was going to be kicked out of his community, so to speak, and be removed from that. And so in that particular case, in that particular context, synagogue was being used as a group of people. Luke chapter 7 and verse 5, we look at the centurion, and he's wanting to Jesus to come and to heal his servant. And the Jewish leaders come to Jesus, and they are speaking on his behalf. And there in Luke chapter 7 and verse 5, they say, and he built our synagogue. Now, he didn't put the people together, but he built the building, didn't he? So we see the word used there in reference to a physical building rather than to the group of people. So the word is very similar to our word church today. We believe that the synagogues began probably actually before the intertestamental period, at least in its initial form, during the 70 years of captivity in Babylon. In Ezekiel chapter 1 and verse 1, it says that the exiles were gathering at the river Chebar. And we can come forward, and we've studied in the book of Acts, in Acts chapter 16 and verse 13, that the Jews that were in Philippi, while they didn't have a synagogue to meet at, they were meeting at the river. So there seems to be a similarity between those two events, or between those two types of meeting. And so, since they couldn't go back to Jerusalem, they couldn't go to the temple, this became something that developed during the captivity, and also because of the dispersion. You know, because of Babylonian captivity, Jews were dispersed all over the world. And so a lot of those people were never going to be able to go to the temple on a Sabbath day, and so they began to meet as groups, and it eventually developed over this 400 years into this idea that we see so clearly in the New Testament of these synagogues. We know that in the first century that there was 480 synagogues just in the city of Jerusalem. And there were 1,000 synagogues, or more than 1,000 synagogues, throughout the first century world during the time of the New Testament. Another two things that I think that we are very familiar with, and yet maybe, and some of these things we don't have a clear beginning. We don't have this clear, this is exactly what happened to make it, just like with synagogues, we know that they kind of what they developed out of. And there's two other things that I think we see very clearly in the New Testament that we also see coming out of this intertestamental period. We read about the Pharisees and the Sadducees quite a bit in the New Testament. Certainly they are Jesus' primary adversaries. But again, you'll never find those names in the Old Testament. You won't find those people, existing before the 400 years between the Testaments. But let's think about those two groups for just a moment and see kind of maybe how they arose, and there is some debate on even how they came about to be. The Sadducees were a group that seemed to have arisen during the time of that Maccabee revolt, that time in which they retook the city of Jerusalem, and they reconsecrated the temple there and began to once again offer sacrifices. They claimed to be from the line of Zadok, and that's where the word Sadducee comes from. Zadok was the high priest during the time of Solomon. And it's not real clear in history whether they actually were a part of the lineage from Zadok, or whether they just took and used his name to try to claim legitimacy, to take hold of the high priesthood. They politicized the priesthood, they politicized the high priesthood and sold it for favor. This group, the Sadducees, they became very Hellenistic, and they leaned toward Greek philosophy, and that's why we see in the New Testament that they do not believe in a resurrection, because Greek philosophers did not believe in a resurrection. And so they did not either. And we know Jesus answers their question about the woman that was married to the 7 brothers and who would be her husband in the afterlife, and Jesus made it very clear that the resurrection was real. In fact, his answer completely silenced them. That seemed to have been their most powerful argument, and yet it failed there. All throughout the New Testament, and even before the New Testament begins, every high priest is a Sadducee. So, for the ones that we see in the New Testament, Caiaphas, Annas, they are Sadducees. They are extremely wealthy. They are extremely powerful. And as a group within the Jewish culture, they are almost universally disliked. Very few Jews actually liked a Sadducee. They took advantage of people and just were not good to the people at all. And so they were not a very well-liked group. And they really, I don't think they really cared as long as the Romans liked them or people that could give them power liked them. The other group is the Pharisees. And it's not surprising, really, that they seem to have arisen at the exact same time that the Sadducees kind of came onto the scene. They were most likely a response to the Sadducees' corruption. They were most likely a response to the Sadducees, basically their lack of religion in general, their lack of faith in God, or lack of care for the law of Moses itself. That they arose from that being in their culture. They were the natural opposition that came about as a result of that. You know, it's almost like we think about grassroots. We use that phrase today, grassroots movements, right? You know, we saw Tea Party a few years ago. We've seen different grassroots groups that really arose out of a response to something that they didn't like, something that they felt was wrong. And so that's how a lot of these things arise. Well, here you have a group now taking control of Jewish society in the Sadducees that really have very little care about the law of Moses. It's natural that those that do care about it are going to then build a response to that, right? They're going to stand up against that. And that's probably how the Pharisees, at least initially, began. Their name literally means to separate. In other words, they wanted to be separate from such things that the Sadducees held them to hold themselves to the law of Moses. And they believed in a strict adherence to the law. In their truest form, the Pharisees hold to the exact same ideas that you and I do. In the Lord's church, we hold to the idea that we strictly adhere to God's Word, that we seek His authority in all that we do, and I think that that is the right way to look at Scripture. In their strictest form, that's exactly what we are. And I want you to note, and this is terribly misconstrued time and time and time again. I hear people say it all the time about, well, don't be a legalist like the Pharisees. Jesus does not condemn the Pharisees for keeping the law and keeping it strictly. That is never a single reason why Jesus condemns. They are condemned for their hypocrisy, and they are condemned because they held traditions on the equal level with God's laws. Right? In fact, they held their traditions above God's laws. Jesus made a very clear point about honoring your father and your mother, right? But they had a tradition that allowed you to hide your money so you didn't have to help your mother and your father. And Jesus says you break the law to keep your tradition. That's what they're condemned for. Keeping the law. Folks, Jesus Christ kept the law perfectly. And He kept it strictly. And so their idea was right. Their motives turned out to be bad. They turned out to allow this to become something of a self-righteous nature, of something that caused them to be hypocrites because they were just simply looking for the praise of men. By the way, the Pharisees added 1,100 traditions to the law of Moses. 1,100 traditions to the law. That's more than the law, than the laws in the law of Moses. And so they really burden down. When we hear Jesus talk about you in Matthew chapter 23, He says you tie on to people burdens that you won't carry yourself. They burden the people down with these traditions. And these times in which they run into Jesus and they have these altercations with Jesus, these arguments with Jesus, such as stripping the grain and things of that nature, all of those are based in the traditions that they had set forth, not in the law of Moses itself. And so the Pharisees came out as a response to the non-religious aspect of the Sadducees, and if they had stayed on the course that they ultimately began on, they probably would have been a very good group. But ultimately, they let themselves stray into hypocrisy, which took them away from the ability to be what they needed to be for Jesus Christ. Most scribes and pretty much all scholars and lawyers in the New Testament would have been a part of the Pharisees. We also see, and I'm not going to spend much time on this one, but we also see that out of this same time frame comes the Herodian family. We see a lot of Herods, right? Now, they're not all the same Herod. It's Herod the Great and his sons as we go through the New Testament. But the beginning of that dynasty in Judea began in the 1st century BC. Now the Jews wound up in a civil war again after they had gained their freedom in the Maccabee revolt. It wasn't long before they wound up in a civil war, and somebody in all of that made the mistake of asking the Romans to come help. Romans don't come help. The Romans come and take over, right? And Pompey comes and he takes over Judah, but in the end, Pompey is subjugated to Julius Caesar. And when Julius Caesar overcomes Pompey, then he gives Judea to a man who helped him, a man named Antipater. And Antipater is the father of Herod the Great. Herod the Great is the one that killed the children looking for Jesus. And his sons would be the ones that would mock Jesus on the night that he died, before he died. It'd be the one that killed James. It would be those men, the one that cut the head off of John the Baptist. So many times we run into this family line there in the nation of Israel, and it had its beginnings also in the intertestamental period. When we look in Daniel, in the book of Daniel, he spends a lot of time prophesying of the history of this time, this 400 years between the Old Testament and the New. Daniel chapter 11 is nothing. I mean, it could be a history book. You could lay it down and it could be a history book to the events that took place with Antiochus Epiphanes and Ptolemy, and the battles that took place, and what eventually resulted in what we talked about earlier, the abomination of desolation in the desecrating of the temple in Jerusalem. But when we look in Daniel chapter 2, we see that Nebuchadnezzar has that great dream, right? He has a dream of this great image, this great statue, so to speak. And this statue has a head of gold, right? And it has arms and shoulders of silver and breast of silver. It has a belly and thighs that are of bronze. It has legs that are of iron, the feet that are iron and clay mixed. Nebuchadnezzar is bothered by this dream, to the point that he wants someone not only to... He wasn't dumb. He kind of knew that his wise men would tell him what he wanted to hear, right? That was always the smart thing for a wise man to do. Tell the king what he wants to hear. He didn't want to hear what he wanted to hear. He wanted to know the truth. And so he demanded that they tell him what the dream was. Now that's a little harder, isn't it? And nobody could do it. He was going to kill them all. And Daniel prayed to God with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And they came up, and God revealed the vision to Daniel. And he came and he told him what the dream was and also interpreted it for him. And in the interpretation of this dream, and what we see in the prophecies in chapters 7 through 12 of Daniel, we see God at work in bringing about the fullness of time that Paul talks about in Galatians chapter 4. He tells Nebuchadnezzar, "O king, you are the head of gold. The Babylonian Empire, you're that head." And what the Babylonian Empire contributes to the fullness of time is what we call that diaspora, or that spreading out of Jews all over the world. He took them out of Judea, and in time, and before they returned 70 years later, many of them have been spread all over the world now. And that's going to be very important in New Testament times, because as we have seen in the book of Acts, time and time and time again, Paul walks into a city and goes straight to what? A synagogue. Goes straight to people that already believe in God. He doesn't have to give the speech he gives in Acts chapter 17 to the Areopagites, explaining to them how God created the world. They have Genesis. They know that. So they already believe in God. You just have to prove to those people that Jesus is the Christ. And so that made for a great foundation in every town that pretty much Paul went to. And so Jews were spread all over the world, and in a preparation for this fullness of time. We see those breast and arms of silver, and that's the Persian Empire. And they returned the Jews back to Judea. That remnant that God said He would preserve. He was going to destroy the nation, but He was going to preserve a small remnant of that nation. The remnant of Judah. The remnant through which Jesus Christ would come. And they would be returned back to Judea. And the Persians would pay for and rebuild the temple of God there in Jerusalem. See the belly and thighs of bronze. The Greek Empire under Alexander the Great, and then the four-way split that became afterwards. And Daniel talks about that too. He talks about the goat with the one horn. And then it got broke off and four horns came out. I mean, the prophecies just write history out like a book in the book of Daniel in this time frame. But that Greek Empire that gave a universal language. Keone Greek that the Bible's predominantly written in. The common man's Greek. But most everybody in the world could read Greek. How easy is that for that time? It's not like today where we can print. If we set our minds to printing Russian Bibles, we can take it to a printer, right? And we can start churning them out by the hundreds, by the thousands. But handwriting the Bible is a little more laborious. How much easier is it for everybody to speak pretty much the same language? Everybody can pretty much speak Greek. And so there's a universal language that is going to make the spread of the gospel easy as well. And that's brought about by this Greek empire. Also, it's during this time by Ptolemy in Egypt and Alexandria that we have the Septuagint. And that's one of those big old words most preachers don't want to even try to pronounce. You may see it indicated in writings. If you're reading some kind of commentary, it may just say LXX, and that's the Septuagint. And what that is it is a Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. And when you read quotes by Jesus in Matthew, or you read quotes by some of the disciples, and you go, well, I look back at where that was quoting in my Old Testament, and it doesn't read the same. That's because your Old Testament is from the Hebrew Bible, and those quotes that they're making in the New Testament are from the Septuagint. They're quoting the translation. Jesus used a translation. The disciples used a translation most of the time in their quotes. Just as we use English translations today. And so there is a slight variance, but nothing of any consequence. And so that's why you sometimes see a difference between the two when you read them. But the Septuagint came out of this time frame as well as they put together that translation, so that all those people, those Jews that are spread all over the world, some of them, they can't read Hebrew. But they can read Greek, right? And so they have access to the Bible, or to the Old Testament, and they have access to those things that are telling them about the Christ. Last of all, you had those legs of iron and those feet that were mixed with iron and clay, and we understand that clearly to be the Roman Empire. And there is so much that the Roman Empire gave to the spread of the gospel. Those magnificent roads, right? Where people could travel rapidly from here to there and all over. A centralized government that made travel very easy. No borders to have to deal with. They made all of those things much easier. Also, in the first century, going into about halfway through the second century, they were experiencing what is known in history as the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. And for the most part, the world was at peace, which made also for an easy spread of the gospel. See, when you hear Paul say that in the fullness of time, God put things together, and Jesus came exactly when He had everything just like He wanted it, so that the gospel and the church could grow as rapidly and as effectively as was possible. And God made that all take place. Note what he says, Daniel says in Daniel chapter 2 and verse 44, as he talks about the kingdom that is the legs of iron and the feet that were mixed with iron and clay. And we've talked about that in the book of Revelation on Wednesday nights. But in verse 44, Daniel says this: in the days of those kings, the Roman kings, Roman emperors, in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which will never be destroyed. And that kingdom will not be left for another people. It will crush and put an end to all these kingdoms, but it will itself endure forever. What Daniel just said, in the fullness of time, God will set up a kingdom, an everlasting kingdom. If you remember in the dream, right, of the great image, that is that stone that's cut out, and it crushes all the others. And notice that he says it's not left for another people. In other words, it's never going to come to an end, so there's never going to be a time when it comes to an end and what they have is left to someone else to take, right? It never ends. It is an eternal kingdom, an everlasting kingdom. And yet we see the preparations for that everlasting kingdom and the time in which it would come about taking place through God's providence all throughout this 400 years of silence. God may have been silent, but He wasn't still. God was in motion. God was moving in His providence to prepare the way for the great work of Jesus Christ that He had been moving toward since before Genesis chapter 1 and verse 1, going all the way back into eternity. Jesus was the plan. Providence is clear in the intertestamental period, folks. I can't tell you in all the ways that God and how God works through providence, but I can tell you one thing. You can look into history and you can see that He does. And you should find encouragement from that God does work in our world. Daniel's whole theme is God controls the nations. God is in control. And He ultimately moves things in the way that He chooses. And we need to have faith in that. Well, all that we've seen tonight was God moving toward that fullness of time. But the most important thing for us tonight is not what took place in the 400 years between Malachi and Matthew, is it? The most important thing for us tonight is what took place in the fullness of time. When Jesus came, He lived. He lived perfectly without sin. Tempted in every way that you and I are tempted, yet without sin. He died on that cross to be the sacrifice that for us, to be a substitutionary sacrifice. I deserve to be there. I deserve to die. But Jesus died for me. And the resurrection from the dead and the establishment of the kingdom that will never end. And because of His resurrection, it truly is an everlasting kingdom, folks. One of these days, you and I, as the children of God, are going to rise from the grave, and that kingdom is going to be delivered, isn't it? Where? To the Father. For the whole of eternity. And, even saying the whole of eternity isn't right, is it? Because there is no whole, it just never stops. It will go on and on without end. Thanks be to God for that. And I hope that you give God thanks for that every day, what He did for you in the fullness of time. This evening you have an opportunity to respond to that action, to what God did, by giving your life to Jesus Christ. If we can help you with that, if we can help you, maybe you've already done that, but you've let yourself stray away, come back. If you need encouragement, if you need prayers, we want to do that. Why don't you come as we stand? Rise up and build in the name of